Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about taxonomy. So, we talk about taxonomy, classification, systematics. We're talking about trying to figure out how to organize organisms into some type of hierarchy so that we can better understand them. And we talk about cladograms, phylogenetic trees, cladistics. We're talking about ways to map out these taxonomical classifications. So, for example, if we have something on the far left where we have, it looks like a little tree branch coming out with these branches coming out to the sides. The way you would read this cladogram here is you would go from here, and you would go up, and then it branches, and then it branches. So, all the way in the back is where you have some ancestral organism that would have had offspring and continue to have offspring until eventually, at some point, the offspring start to look differently. So maybe you've got a population of rabbits and they're all gray, but at some point a mutation occurs and now you have black rabbits and gray rabbits. And then also the rabbits that are black stay together and the rabbits that are gray stay together. And then they start to find their own little territories and they get geographically isolated. Well, as they live in their own environments for longer and longer periods of time, they start to get more and more genetically and phenotypically different until eventually they no longer breed with each other, or maybe they no longer can breed with each other, in which case you get two different species. So a cladogram tries to map out this speciation into these clades. And at a fork in a cladogram is where you have a common ancestor of those two organisms. So with the rabbit example, or maybe finches, they might be very genetically similar, they just no longer breed with each other. And maybe they could, but behaviorally, they just no longer do, in which case we would still say it is different species. So, I mean, it's arbitrary how we define that, but that's how it is currently defined. Now, for this next cladogram, it's the same thing, it's just written a little bit differently. It's actually saying the exact same thing as this diagram. It's just more square instead of, more branched and smooth. So for this one, the common ancestor would be all the way back here, and then there was some kind of speciation event, maybe geographic isolation or a mutation or something that happens, and they start to become separate. And then over thousands and thousands of years, they start to look more and more different. Then there's another speciation event from diverging from some type of common ancestor. And then what you can do is you can add different traits that emerge where those splits occur. So for the rabbit example, right, it was all gray, and then you had a mutation that created some black rabbits. So then you would have black fur coming about here for organism C as it started to develop. So some kind of new trait developed there. Now, traditionally, this was based on, because there was no genetics, so it was all based on just observation. What do these organisms look like? And that was sort of the traditional way of doing things. And as it became more sophisticated, taxonomy, you were able to not just on morphology, but also you could include genetic analysis. And sometimes that would give you a deeper, more detailed picture of how these organisms are related to each other. And it can create different cladograms or different types of phylogenetic trees. And then also, indicating those traits across are helpful in determining what traits these organisms have that might have caused them to come out on their own clade. So here's an example how you've got tortoise, horse, wolf, leopard, house cat. You've got these branches. So as time goes on, time is going this way. So the farther back we go, the farther back in time we're going, and the farther in time ago we have a common ancestor for those two organisms. So up here, the leopard and the house cat could have a common ancestor much more recently than the house cat and the wolf, although they could still share a common ancestor. And then, of course, the traits are indicated on the bottom. Usually what you do when you build these is you want to put the organism at the very beginning that has the least shared characteristics. So all of these traits on the bottom where they go, like you see hair right here, hair, everything past this point has hair. So all of these organisms are sharing the trait of hair. Carnivores, that's only going to be from here above. Retractable claws, purring, and so forth. So the organism that has the least shared characteristics or traits is what you're going to put at the very beginning, and we call that the out group. Here's another way of drawing it. So they can get more and more complex, and they can get pretty massive. For this one, it's not too bad, but you'll see it splits here, and then they show you this trait that emerges here, and then they diverge into these two different groups, so on and so forth. So what's neat about this is it helps you create these, essentially it's like a pedigree, usually written upside down of how you would write a pedigree. It's really just a family tree of how these organisms are related to each other. Now, when they created this taxonomical classification system, it was one of the difficulties early on was figuring out, well, how many categories do we have? Well, at some level, you want to be able to name one specific thing. So species is specific. The species name, only one organism has that specific species name. But some organisms are similar to each other. So we might want to put those in a higher classification that includes many different types of organisms. Right? We're talking about humans. The genus species for humans is Homo sapiens. So the genus Homo includes many different types of species. You could have Homo sapiens or Homo erectus, and Homo erectus would be an upright human-like organism. It's in the same genus, but it's a different species. So you want to have a classification system where you can group these animals in all these different groups so that you can classify them based on their relatedness. So domains would include, and that's why they made this bar so big, because it's really high in this hierarchy. It includes, if all the domains would include all of life on Earth. But then as you move down, perhaps to the animal kingdom, and then you continue to go until you get to Homo sapiens, we're talking about one organism, one species. Now, I don't use, well, I do every now and then try to use ChatGPT to save time with like researching things, because it can go and just aggregate tons of data and pull it together at once. And I've always looked for charts like this, but I couldn't find one anywhere. So I just asked ChatGPT to tell me how many total phyla are there, how many total classes, orders, families, and it would read, 30 different research papers and compile and aggregate those together to make an estimate of how many organisms are in those categories. So this is really cool. But the domain, there are 3 domains. We have archaea. They call them ancient bacteria. They're actually more closely related to eukaryotes than they are to bacteria, but when you just look at them, they look more like bacteria. But you have 3 domains. You have archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. So we have our eukaryotes, our prokaryotes, and then archaea, which look like bacteria, but they're a different type of classification. So all of life fits into these 3 categories, right? Plants, eukaryotes. Streptococcus is going to be prokaryote bacteria. So any life form on the planet is going to fit into one of these 3 categories. But as you move down in that classification, you get more categories that fit more organisms in them. So for example, kingdoms, there are 6 kingdoms. We have Archaebacteria, Eubacteria, Protista, fungi, plantae, and Animalia. So all of life on Earth fits into those 6 categories. And then we move down into broader and broader categories, more and more specific categories. So phylum, there are 53 classes. There's 150 to 200. Now, this is how many different categories there are. So you can imagine how many organisms fit in to each of those categories, right? 175 classes could have thousands of organisms. Orders, 550 to 700. You'll see it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until you get to species, and there have been 2 million species described, but they believe that there's anywhere from 10 million to 1 trillion different species on the planet. So when you get to the species level, you're talking about one specific thing. domain level is very general. It's talking about many different things, or different animals or organisms. And then here's a visual of what that looks like, right? Eukaryotes, all eukaryotes. But then we can narrow that down into just the animals, then chordata, and then the mammals, carnivores. Then we keep going until we get to the genus, species, one specific species. And, of course, Darwin, as we talked about before, had his famous I think drawing to show the potential relatedness of different organisms. And he had looked at that with his finches, of course. And you can see here how these organisms could map out on just a massive phylogenetic tree, or what they might call a tree of life. Here we have bacteria, archaea, eukaryotes. Everything fits into these branches. And then here are the 6 kingdoms to kind of give you a visual of how diverse they can be. So when you talk about classifying organisms in this hierarchy, some organisms are a little bit easier to classify than others. So we're talking about animals. Well, we can look at, do they breed with each other? When they breed, is their offspring viable? Is their offspring fertile? Can they even breed with each other? Do they even have the same number of chromosomes? There's so many things you can look at with animals that makes classification a little bit easier to determine, like if they're the same species. And then, of course, they're large, lots of them, so you can figure out their traits by observation pretty easy. But when you talk about bacteria, how to figure out that can be a little bit more tricky because they reproduce asexually. So when you look at them, 2 different species might even look identical. But when something else you can factor in with bacteria will be used more is the genetics of it. You can sequence their DNA and see if there's a significant difference. And then also you can look at their arrangements. Are they in a string? Are they to have some kind of tetrad structure? How do they aggregate themselves together? Can also influence that. And then here's another picture of what that might look like for the classification for a cat. All the different categories until you get to this final genus, species. So domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. You could probably look up a good way to remember that. I don't have any good memory tricks. My memory trick is I just say it really fast, and it happens to work out pretty well. And again, just some pictures of these different groups and how they're laid out. But being able to read these and interpret them is really helpful, because once you learn how to read one of them, you pretty much can read them all. Just make sure you start at the beginning. That could be at the top. Usually it's written at the bottom, and often it's written at the bottom left. But then you just read it from there, and this would be the most ancient organism, and the most ancestral or primordial traits would be the farthest back. And then we call these derived characters that come about later. They're derived over evolutionary time. And then if you want to pause the video and just look at the differences between these 6 kingdoms to see why they fit into different categories. Because if they were all just insanely similar, then we wouldn't need different categories. But because of those differences, it's helpful to have a classification system. So if you find something new, you know where to fit it in that classification system. And if you know what it's similar to, you can infer other characteristics, even genetic characteristics, based on what other animals it's very similar to. So it's super helpful. It can help you make predictions, and it's good for organization. So the way they write a genus species, they call this binomial nomenclature, a 2-name naming system. And we only write, you can write the full classification, but generally you only write the genus and the species. So here we have Homo sapiens again. And the way you write it is you italicize, you see how it's all italicized here, and you capitalize the genus name, you lowercase the species name, and you italicize all of it. So here we have for the tiger, Panthera, tigris, capital, genus, all italics, lowercase, species. And that's all of the organisms that we've identified on planet Earth fit into this classification system. Now, there are different theories on how many phyla to have. If you look back at that photo I shared of how many different classes, family, order, all of that there's a range because people disagree about how many categories we actually need, and when it's necessary to create a new category. So what is a species? A species is going to be a group of organisms that will reproduce with each other and produce fertile offspring. So things that can prevent organisms from reproducing, maybe two different species. It could be something that's pre-zygotic. So zygote is after the sperm meets the egg, you get a zygote. So any pre-zygotic barrier is going to prevent that zygote from surviving or forming. And then post-zygotic barriers are going to be things that prevent that organism, after a zygote has been formed, from developing properly, surviving, or reproducing. So we have two different categories for this. So some examples of prezygotic barriers, you could have an ecological or geographical barrier. So the species live in different habitats. So that prevents them from breeding. So they have reproductive isolation. They're in two different places reproducing. It's going to lead to greater change over time, eventually maybe speciation. It could be that maybe they're in the same area, but they just breed at different times, in which case they won't breed with each other to form a zygote. So it's preventing the zygote formation. Could be their behavior, maybe a mating display, or even a voice. For example, Darwin's finches, it's thought that they all came from a mainland finch, and their genetics are very similar. They could breed with each other, technically, genetically, but because their beaks have changed so much, they don't recognize each other's bird songs, their mating calls anymore, so they don't breed with each other. So technically, we would say they're two different species, even though they could breed, but they don't breed. Maybe the size gets so different that physically they can no longer reproduce. Or maybe the species mate, but a zygote cannot form from the egg and sperm because the gametes are too different. And then post-zygotic, if a zygote forms, maybe the resulting hybrid just dies. So the hybrid is inviable. Or maybe the offspring, the hybrid, is infertile. So they're two different species breed, and their offspring is healthy, vibrant. Maybe it even does well, but it can't breed. Well, in that case, it's just going to die. So these are different prezygotic and postzygotic barriers to reproduction. So the definition of a hybrid would be the offspring of two separate but closely related species. They have to be closely enough related for the sperm and the egg to actually produce a viable offspring, or just to produce a offspring, but it may be inviable if it dies or infertile. And oftentimes they will be infertile. So Pisley would be the hybrid of a polar bear and a grizzly bear. And then a zedonk would be a hybrid of a donkey and a zebra. And it seems like these are made up, but these are actually true, or these are actually real. You've probably heard of a liger, a hybrid of a male lion and a female tiger, and then a tigon, hybrid of a male tiger and a female lion. And then, of course, the liger, if you've seen Napoleon Dynamite, that's where, if you thought that was fake, that's actually real. Although they are not magical, as Napoleon Dynamite did say that they have magical powers, they do not. Mule hybrid cross between a horse and a donkey. That was very common back in Bible times. Cross a horse and a donkey, you get a strong mule, but it's infertile. It cannot breed. A jaglion, hybrid between a male jaguar and a female lion. So again, it's easier to classify these animals because it's much easier to observe when they reproduce, when they don't, why they don't, what do the offspring look like. But with bacteria, it's much more tricky. So what they do to define a bacterial species is it's a group of organisms that share a high degree of genetic similarity, forming a coherent cluster within a phylogenetic tree and exhibit similar phenotypic characteristics. So it's going to be a little bit tougher, but you can look at their physical shape, how they aggregate themselves with each other, and what their genetics look like. So it's a little bit more tricky. And then you can use taxonomic keys to actually classify an organism. So someone could make a key, and then you could use that to try to more objectively fit a new animal that's discovered into the proper category. So for example, here we have 4 different shapes, and you would read the dichotomous key. Dichotomous, you have 2 choices at every point in the key, and it just walks you through to try to classify the organisms, or in this case, it's shapes. So the first thing says the figure with distinct corners or points. Okay, if it has distinct corner or points, then we would go to number 2. Or if it does not, we could look at 1B. So we could start here. Does it have distinct corners or not? If it's a 1B, it says figure without distinct corners or points. Well, then we already know the name. They've made up some names here. Roundus, if it does not have distinct corners or points. But what if it did? Well, let's say we started here, figure with distinct corners or points. We would go to number 2. Well, figure with more than 3 sides or figure with 3 sides. Well, let's say, okay, the figure has 3 sides. Well, then the name is triangulus. So you can have a dichotomous key to help you figure out what an organism's classification is. Thank you.